Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive with us. And, knowing a little bit about our audience and their philosophical interests, I thought today we could delve into something really fascinating. It's how some age-old questions about fairness, decision-making and the ways we interact socially are being examined with some surprisingly formal methods. We're talking about the intersection of logic, game theory, computer science.
Indeed.
Offering a fresh perspective on some pretty fundamental philosophical ideas. I think there are going to be some real aha moments in store for us as we see how abstract philosophical concepts meet concrete algorithmic analysis.
Exactly. And the source that's going to be guiding us on this journey today is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Okay.
Entry on formal approaches to social procedures. So really a rigorous and well-structured exploration of how logic and mathematics are being used to understand everything from a simple agreement between two people to complex societal structures.
So it's a pretty wide range.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to uncover how these formal methods can be used to model, analyze, and even propose ways to refine the social procedures that really shape our lives. And crucially, how this relates to core philosophical concepts like fairness, rationality, and knowledge.
Those are the big ones.
They are indeed.
Yeah, let's start with fairness.
Okay.
Because, philosophers have been grappling with this concept for ages.
Absolutely.
It's one of those things that feels so intuitive on the surface, right? Like we all have this sense of what's fair and what's not. But trying to define it precisely can feel like trying to catch smoke. It's elusive.
It's very elusive.
And what I find so fascinating about these formal approaches is how they attempt to do just that.
Exactly.
To create precise definitions and then analyze different procedures against those definitions. Now, of course, our source wisely points out that just having these formal tools doesn't magically resolve the underlying philosophical debates about what true fairness is.
Of course not.
Right. It's not like the math gives us the answer to the ultimate ethical question.
Exactly.
But what it does do is equip us with incredibly sharp analytical instruments to really dissect these concepts.
Precisely. To really illustrate this idea that fairness is complex, that there are multiple competing notions. I thought we could start by looking at the story about Ram Shyam and the traveler.
Oh, okay, I remember this one.
You recall the situation. So we have Ram. He starts off with 3 chapatis. Shyam starts off with 5.
Okay.
They meet a traveler who's hungry. They decide to share their chapatis equally with the traveler.
Generous guys.
They are, and the traveler, after the meal, offers them 8 gold coins as payment.
Okay.
Now, the question arises, how should they divide these coins fairly between the two of them?
Right, because it wasn't an equal contribution to start with.
Exactly.
But how do you even approach that?
Well, we immediately get 3 very plausible answers, and each of these answers is backed by a rationale.
Okay, let's hear them.
So Ram suggests a simple equal split, 4 coins each.
Makes sense on the surface, yeah.
Shyam, on the other hand, argues for a split, proportional to their initial contribution.
Okay.
So he says, I started with 5. You started with 3. It should be 5 for me and 3 for you. And then comes Mulvey, and Mulvey proposes a division of 1 coin for Ram, 7 coins for Shyam.
Whoa. Okay, that seems a little...
It's a little surprising, right?
Yeah. How did he arrive at that?
Well, his reasoning is quite interesting. He points out that the traveler consumed 8 over 3 chapatis.
Okay.
Right? 8 divided by 3. And since Ram only began with 3 chapatis, he effectively contributed only 1/3 of a chapati to the traveler's meal, whereas Shyam contributed the remaining 7/3.
Okay. I'm following the math.
So according to this logic, the payment should also be split 1-7.
So even though it feels kind of counterintuitive on the surface, there's a logic to it.
There's definitely a logic to it.
Yeah, and what strikes me most about this whole story is that it really highlights how even in a seemingly simple scenario like this, fairness isn't this single self-evident concept. It's almost like we've got this landscape of competing justifiable principles.
Exactly.
Right? Like each person has a reasonable argument for why their division is the fair one.
That's the fascinating part, isn't it?
Yeah, so it seems like we almost need these formal methods, these precise lenses, to even distinguish between these different types of fairness.
Absolutely.
Right, so it's not just about calculating the answer, it's about defining the problem in the first place.
Exactly. The formal analysis often begins with our intuitive grasp of what we think is fair, and then tries to formalize it. The tools can then help us rigorously examine the implications of that specific definition of fairness. But they don't tell us which definition is ultimately the philosophically correct one.
That's still up for debate.
That's still up for debate.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get a little bit more concrete and talk about a procedure that's used quite a bit in, everyday life, and that's divide and choose.
Okay.
For two people splitting something, it seems pretty straightforward.
It does.
One person divides the thing, and the other gets to pick which piece they want.
Right. Very elegant in its simplicity.
Yeah.
And widely considered to be a fair protocol for two parties.
Yeah.
But I think the crucial aspect to consider here is that of individual valuations. You can think of a valuation function as simply how much each person values different parts of what's being divided.
Okay, so it's like your preferences boiled down to a personal scale.
Exactly. So let's say we're dividing a cake.
Okay, everybody loves cake.
And this cake has different toppings. Let's say half of it is chocolate, half of it is vanilla.
Right.
Now, your valuation of the chocolate half might be much higher than mine, and vice versa for the vanilla.
Yeah, I'm definitely a chocolate person, so I'd value that halfway more.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that Hugo Steinhaus observed that if our valuations differ like this, it's actually possible for both of us to feel like we got more than half according to our own preferences.
How is that even possible?
Well, because fairness in this case isn't about objectively equal portions. It's about subjective satisfaction based on our desires.
So even though the pieces might look different, we both feel like we got what we wanted.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
And here's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
When we start factoring in what each person knows about the other person's preferences.
Oh, so it's not just about the division itself. It's about the knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
The source points out that if neither of us knows the other's valuation, the person doing the choosing actually has the advantage.
Oh, that makes sense
Because they can just pick the piece they value most highly based on their own scale without having to worry about outsmarting the other person.
Okay, so in a situation where you've got no information, choosing is better.
Choosing is better.
Okay, what if we both know each other's valuations?
Then the dynamic shifts completely. Now, as the cutter, knowing your preferences perfectly, I might divide the cake strategically in such a way that I know the piece I'll be left with is more valuable to me,
Sneaky.
even if it appears less appealing to you.
Okay, so knowledge is power in this case.
Knowledge is power in this case.
Yeah, so it seems like this idea of knowledge and ignorance plays a crucial role in the design and analysis of these fair division protocols.
It's not just about the algorithm itself. It's about the information that's available to the participants.
Yeah, that's where I guess epistemic logic comes into play.
Exactly. Epistemic logic gives us a formal way to reason about what different agents know and believe, and how that knowledge or lack thereof influences their actions and the outcome of these social procedures.
Which is something that maybe some of the more traditional studies of fair division overlooked.
I think so.
Okay, so divide and choose is great for two people. What happens when we have more than two participants?
Right, because then things get a little more complex. We can think of this as the classic problem of cake cutting.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this.
It's a metaphor for dividing a single heterogeneous good.
So not just like a simple pie where every slice is the same. It's more like, imagine dividing up an estate.
Right.
You've got land investments, all sorts of things. And each heir might value those things differently.
Precisely. And when we have more than two people, we have to start thinking about different levels of fairness.
Okay, like what?
So we have something called simply fair.
Simply fair.
Which means that each person feels that they have received at least their proportional share.
Okay.
So if there are Merricks, everyone feels like they got at least 1/n of the total value.
Okay.
According to their own valuation, of course. But as the source points out, a division can be simply fair and still leave some room for resentment.
Right, because even though I might get what I perceive to be my fair share, I might still be envious of what you got.
Exactly. That's why we have this stronger notion called envy-free.
Envy-free.
Where no participant believes that anyone else received a piece they would have preferred.
So no one's looking over the fence and wishing they had their neighbor's piece.
Precisely.
So can you actually achieve both simple fairness and envy-freeness at the same time?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially when you have more than two people. We know that I cut, you choose works beautifully for two people.
Right. It's both fair and envy-free. But with three or more...
It becomes much more tricky.
Okay, so what do you do?
Well, there's an algorithm called the Banach-Nasser algorithm, which is designed for these situations with three or more participants.
Okay, how does that work?
It's an iterative process. So you have a designated cutter who proposes a piece.
Okay.
And the others can object.
I don't like that piece.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if someone objects, they can trim the piece further.
Okay.
And the last person to trim, if anyone does trim, then gets that piece, provided no one else objects to that smaller piece.
Okay, so it's like a back and forth negotiation.
It is, until you reach a point where one person is happy with a piece.
And then you just keep going until eventually you're left with two people, and then they do divide and choose.
Exactly.
Okay, so I can see how that would lead to a fair division, but it seems like it could get pretty complicated.
It can be quite involved.
Yeah, and our source mentions how Rohit Parikh used theoretical computer science methods and something called game logic to formally analyze this algorithm.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
What Parikh does is he models the steps of the Banach-Naster algorithm using game logic.
Okay.
And he defines a loop operation, which represents the act of trimming the cake.
Okay.
And then he identifies an invariant proposition, which is denoted as FM Yoko.
FMK.
Yeah, so this proposition is a guarantee that at each step of this cake-cutting process, there's still enough cake left to give the remaining Kaur people their fair share, assuming Eka cuts have already been made.
Okay, so it's like a checkpoint,
Yeah,
making sure you haven't gone too far.
Precisely. And Parikh then demonstrates that this trimming action preserves this invariant.
Meaning?
If you start with enough cake for M people. And this property holds initially. Then throughout each step of cutting and trimming, the remaining cake always satisfies this necessary condition for the remaining participants.
So it's like a proof that you're always on the right track.
It is. And this allows him to formally prove that this algorithm reliably leads to a fair division.
So it's a beautiful example of how logic can be applied to these real-world problems.
Absolutely. It brings rigor to these social procedures.
Okay, well, let's move from the world of cake to a slightly more dramatic scenario.
Okay.
And that is Solomon's judgment.
Ah, yes, the classic biblical story.
You know, the two mothers both claiming the same child, a situation full of emotion
Absolutely.
and uncertainty.
And Solomon's proposed solution to cut the baby in half.
A little drastic.
It was certainly not a fair division procedure in the traditional sense,
No.
but it served as a way to elicit an emotional response from the true mother.
Right, because the true mother would rather give up the child than see it harmed.
Exactly.
So it was a way to reveal the truth
Precisely.
through this kind of test. But our source then goes on to present a more repeatable procedure. That's inspired by this idea.
Okay.
So how does this procedure work?
So in this procedure, the first woman is asked to give up the child,
Okay.
and then the second woman. And if both of them refuse,
Then what?
then Solomon takes the child. And he allows each woman to submit a sealed bid to buy the child back.
Oh, interesting.
And the price is set at the average of the two bids.
So it's like an auction almost.
It is a form of option. And what's really at play here, as highlighted by Moore and Pauley, is the interplay of common knowledge and ignorance.
Okay, how so?
So Solomon initially doesn't know who the true mother is,
Right.
but both women, of course, do. So the procedure leverages the likely difference in their valuations of the child.
Right, because the true mother is going to value the child more
Much more.
than the imposter, so she's probably going to bid higher.
Exactly. And by averaging the bids, Solomon aims to extract this difference in valuation and effectively determine the true mother.
At least the one who values the child more.
Precisely.
And again, epistemic logic is useful here
It is neat.
for analyzing how those states of knowledge influence the outcome.
Right. So we've talked about fairness. We've talked about these difficult scenarios.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to another fundamental aspect of social interaction, which is how we form pairings or matches.
Yeah, like romantic relationships or, assigning students to colleges.
Exactly. Finding stable and desirable pairings is a crucial part of many social processes.
Yeah, it affects our lives in so many ways.
And it turns out there's a whole formal framework for analyzing these scenarios.
Okay.
Starting with what's called the stable marriage problem.
The stable marriage problem. Okay, so paint me a picture. What are we talking about here?
So imagine two sets.
Okay.
Let's say a set of men and a set of women.
Okay.
And each individual in these sets has a strict preference ordering for everyone in the opposite set.
It's like a ranked list.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the stable marriage problem asks, can we find a pairing?
Like a one-to-one matching.
Exactly. A marriage matching, where there are no two people, one from each set, who both prefer each other over their current partners.
Oh, so you're trying to avoid a situation where two people are matched with people they don't really like that much.
Right.
And they'd rather be with each other.
Exactly, because that would destabilize the matching.
So a stable matching. is one where no one has an incentive to switch partners.
Precisely, no such blocking pairs exist.
Okay, so is it always possible to find such a stable matching?
That was the breakthrough by Gale and Shapley. They proved that no matter what the preference lists are, a stable matching always exists.
Wow.
And they even came up with an algorithm.
To actually find it.
To find one, yes.
So how does this Gale-Shapley algorithm actually work?
So it proceeds in rounds.
Rounds.
And initially, everyone is considered free.
Okay.
In each round, every free man proposes to his most preferred woman on his list, to whom he hasn't yet proposed. And when a woman receives proposals, if she's free, she accepts.
Okay.
But if she's already engaged,
She's got options.
she does. She compares the proposer to her current fiancé. And if she prefers the new proposer, she breaks off the engagement.
And the fiancé goes back to being free?
Becomes free again. And she gets engaged to the proposer.
Okay.
And it keeps going until everyone is engaged.
Okay, I get it. So it's like a musical chairs kind of situation.
In a way, yes. Our source provides a nice example with 3 men and 3 women
Okay.
to illustrate how this works.
So let's say the men are A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And the women are D, E, and F. And they all have their preference lists.
Exactly.
And you run this algorithm, and you end up with, let's say, A is matched with E,
Okay.
B is matched with F, and C is matched with D.
Right.
Now, what's interesting is D ended up with her least preferred man, but the matching is still stable.
Exactly.
How does that work?
Well, if we consider any pair
Hmm.
who are not married to each other in this final matching, it can't be the case that they both prefer each other over their current spouses.
Okay, so there's no situation where two people are looking at each other longingly across the room,
Exactly.
wishing they were together.
Precisely.
Okay, how do we know that?
Well, let's say man R prefers woman W over his current wife,
Okay.
and woman W prefers M over her current husband. Then during the algorithm would have eventually proposed to W.
Oh, that's right, because he goes down his list.
Exactly. And if W was free, she would have accepted.
Yeah.
And if she was engaged to someone she liked less, she would have broken it off and accepted M.
Okay.
So the fact that they ended up with other partners means that at some point, either didn't propose to W or W rejected him.
Okay, so it systematically eliminates those unstable pairs.
Exactly.
That's pretty clever.
It's a very clever algorithm.
Yeah.
It not only shows us that stable matches exist, but it reveals a trade-off.
Oh, what's that?
Stability comes at a cost. Often one side has a better outcome than the other.
Right, so it's not necessarily about perfect happiness. It's about stability.
It's about avoiding chaos.
Okay. And speaking of one side having an advantage,
Right.
the Gale-Shapley algorithm is known to have a proposer advantageous property.
It does.
So in the standard version where the men propose, the matching tends to be better for the men.
On average, yes. If you flip it and have the women propose, then the outcome favors the women.
Interesting. So it's not neutral?
It's not new.
Okay. And our source also mentions some other interesting aspects of the algorithm,
It does.
like its efficiency. It has what's called quadratic time complexity.
Right. Which means the runtime increases at a manageable rate as the number of participants grows.
So it's practical even for large groups.
Exactly.
Okay. And then there's the issue of manipulation,
Right.
because you can imagine people trying to game the system,
Absolutely.
misrepresent their preferences to get a better match.
Exactly. But thankfully, researchers have explored other stable matching procedures
Yeah.
that are much harder to manipulate.
So there are ways to make it more robust.
There are.
And all of this isn't just theoretical, this algorithm. And variations of it are used in all sorts of real-world scenarios,
Absolutely.
like assigning medical residents to hospitals,
Right.
students to schools. And the source even talks about the Stanford University housing draw.
Yes. A fascinating example.
So how does that work?
Well, it's based on the Gale-Shapley algorithm, but with added complexities.
Okay, like what?
So students only rank a limited number of housing options, and they can apply in groups.
Oh, that makes it more complicated.
It does. But what's interesting is that for the students themselves, this draw mechanism is strategy proof.
Strategy proof? What does that mean?
So it means that they don't gain anything by misrepresenting their preferences for the houses they actually rank.
So they might as well be honest.
Exactly.
Okay, but there's a catch, right?
There is. They can still strategize about which houses to include in their list.
Oh, so they can't lie about the order.
Right.
But they can choose which ones to put on there.
Precisely.
And you know what's really interesting here is that most students
Administrators.
don't actually understand the algorithm, but they still think it's fair.
They do.
That's fascinating.
Isn't it? They
Yeah.
trust the outcome, even without understanding the mechanism.
So it raises a question about how much does knowledge actually matter? When it comes to accepting these social procedures, is it about understanding the rules, or is it about feeling like the outcome is just...
A deep philosophical question.
Yeah.
Can a procedure be considered legitimate if people don't understand how it works?
It seems like in this case it can be.
It does.
Yeah, okay, well, we've talked about fairness, we've talked about matching. Now let's shift gears
Okay.
and talk about something that's fundamental to all social interaction, and that is communication.
Right. Especially in our increasingly interconnected world,
Yeah.
with issues of privacy responsibility and coordination in distributed systems, this becomes really crucial.
And you know what's interesting is that communication, whether between individuals or within a network of computers.
Right. Operates according to certain protocols and logical structures.
Yeah, so there's a formal aspect to it.
There is. And the relationship between our social practices and the formal solutions that have been developed in computer science is quite fascinating.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Well, the source talks about the talking stick.
Oh, yeah, the social protocol. Well, only the person holding the stick can speak.
Exactly. It's a way to ensure orderly discussion.
Yeah, everyone gets their turn.
Precisely. And this simple convention finds a formal analogy in distributed computing
Oh, really? How so?
with something called the token ring protocol.
The token ring protocol.
So in this network, a small digital token circulates among computers.
Yeah.
And only the computer holding the token can transmit data.
So it's like the digital equivalent of the talking stick.
Exactly.
Okay, I love that analogy.
And once the transmission is done, the token is passed on to the next computer.
So it ensures that everyone gets a chance to communicate. And no one's talking over each other.
Precisely.
Okay, but what happens if this digital token gets lost?
Right, that's a problem. That's where the leader election problem comes in.
Leader election, what is that?
So if the token disappears, the network needs a way to regenerate it
Okay.
and to designate a leader to manage this process.
So it's like choosing a new person to hold the talking stick.
Precisely. There's an elegant algorithm for this.
Oh, let's hear it.
Each computer sends a message with its unique ID,
Okay.
clockwise around the ring. And when a computer receives an ID, it compares it to its own. If the received ID is higher, it passes the message along.
Okay.
If it's lower, it discards it.
Yeah.
But if it receives its own ID, that means it has the highest ID.
And it becomes the leader.
It declares itself the leader.
Wow, that's pretty clever.
It is. And it works without any computer needing to know the size of the network.
Or the other IDs.
Exactly.
So it's a completely decentralized solution. I love it.
It's quite elegant.
Yeah. And the source then takes this idea even further and talks about multi-agent systems.
Right. Well, we're not just talking about computers, but about interacting autonomous agents.
So this could be software programs, robots, even abstract models of human actors.
Precisely.
And what are the key characteristics of these multi-agent systems?
Well, each agent is autonomous.
They make their own decisions.
They do. They typically have only a local view.
They don't see the whole picture.
Right. And there's no central controller.
So it's like a society of individuals,
You get it.
each acting according to their own rules, but somehow they have to coordinate.
That's the challenge.
And a concept that keeps coming up in all of this.
Host speaker.